Is New York Financial Writers Association discussion with two hot shots from the world of tech journalism, online tech journalism. And they both have Substack newsletters. So we want to explore the world of Substack for an audience that consists of mostly fellow journalists, some of whom may be thinking that they want to do a Substack someday. And so we want to talk somewhat about the substance of your beats, but probably a little more about the form, about how you go about doing what you do. So we'll go back and forth between questions from me, statements from the two guys. They can talk to each other. They know each other well. And then questions from the audience. So I just want to introduce the two panelists. Casey Newton, founder and editor of Platformer, publication about the intersection of tech and democracy. Prior to founding Platformer in October 2020, he was the longtime Silicon Valley editor of The Verge. While at The Verge, his stories on the lives of American content moderators for Facebook and Google sparked a national conversation about working conditions for this essential but often neglected part of the workforce. He was a finalist for the National Magazine Award for reporting. The weekly free edition of Platformer now reaches almost 50,000 people. In April, he announced Side Channel, a community he runs with 7 other independent journalists. He interviewed Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, I should say Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg, about their Discord server. And I've just to elaborate a little bit from other stuff I picked up. He left The Verge. He was at The Verge for 7 years, covering Silicon Valley, writing a daily newsletter called The Interface, graduated at Northwestern. He also wrote earlier in his career for the Arizona Republic, the San Francisco Chronicle, and CNET. And Eric Newcomer, the author of the startup and venture capital newsletter Newcomer. It has more than 11,000 readers and more than 1,300 paying subscribers. Eric spent nearly 6 years at Bloomberg, where the two of us overlapped. He covered the ins and outs of the startup world for much of that time, breaking news on IPOs, fundraising rounds, and M&A. Prior to that, he was the first employee at The Information. So he started Newcomer in October 2020, the same time Casey started. When he was at Bloomberg, I will add, occasionally wrote for Businessweek, which is where I used to write until I joined the New York Times this past summer. Early in his career, he had brief gigs at the Washington Examiner, covering DC City Hall, and then was with The Information in San Francisco. I am the economics columnist for the New York Times opinion section. And although I don't really know Eric or Casey, we know a lot of people in common. Journalism is a small world, a lot of overlaps. For example, Charlie Warzel, who was one of the people in Side Channel, had been at the New York Times opinion section, started the Substack, now he's at the Atlantic. So a lot of crisscross and interesting combinations of careers. So a lot of things we can do here, but again, since I think this is sort of a professional development session, I'm going to try to ask you guys about, what it's been like for you doing this, and what are the pluses and minuses of being on Substack. So let's go with Casey first.
Yeah. Pluses and minuses. I mean, I think the big plus is that I feel like I've never had more control over my own destiny. I used to work for newspapers and spent, basically the first 8 years of my career watching my colleagues get laid off as like Gannett shoot up the business. And then moved to digital platforms and was starting to feel pretty good about those and like sort of big scaled up digital ad businesses. And then platforms started to eat the digital ad business. And I was sick of it, man. Like I wanted to see if I could find a more sustainable path forward. And because we now live in this world where folks like myself are able to, make money directly from our readers, it felt like it was worth a shot. And, in the year since, I'm now in a position where I feel like I'm able to write the stories that I want to write. I feel like I'm able to have the impact that I want to have, but now I can also make deals. Like I'm a contributor at CNBC. I have a deal with The Verge to be a contributing editor there. And, my paying subscribers, like that number kind of continues to grow over time. There's like the simplest reason to why I did this was I wanted to buy a house in San Francisco, and you need $1 million. And like the only way that was ever going to happen was if I started a company, right? So that's all going really well. Those are all pluses. Like, what sucks about it? Like the California Franchise Tax Board, I would say sucks. Trying to get those people on the phone after they make a mistake, that'll sort of knock out a whole afternoon. There is just kind of a lot of administrative stuff that goes into this that I think can be a challenge. I think, it's hard to have a bad month in this line of work, right? Like, when I worked at The Verge, like I wasn't really productive in 2017 because I was depressed about the election. That would be really hard for me in this line of work, right? Like I had forgiving editors who basically said, well, we'll give you some time to figure it out. I don't really have that luxury anymore. So I'm sure there's a lot more to talk about, but those are some things that kind of are at the top of my mind.
Casey, just sticking on the question about the administrative part and the California Tax Board and so on. The pitch of Substack is that they do all that for you. So that's not the case?
No, I mean, like they're not going to help you figure out, for example, whether you should start an LLC. They're not going to figure out your taxes or bookkeeping for you. Maybe eventually they will, but that's all stuff that I have an accountant, I have a bookkeeper. I have to kind of, keep on top of that stuff. And then I do have to file a regular paperwork with California. I opened up my LLC using a company called Stripe, which makes it very easy, but they set you up in Delaware. So now I pay taxes to 2 states essentially for no reason. Like that was just a mistake that I made. So just sort of like learning those things has, been part of the journey.
Yeah. What does Substack do for you?
So, I mean, number one, obviously they build a software platform that distributes the emails. And then they provide other perks on top of that. So they provide me with a healthcare subsidy, for example. They also just kind of help me figure out healthcare. They provide legal protection. So if a billionaire ever sues me, they have said they will protect me, although that's really more of a verbal agreement.
At their discretion.
Yeah. So that's sort of remains to be seen. They're more recently, they've come to me and they want to help me with publicity. And we're talking about things like, doing live events together. So they're kind of still figuring out all of that stuff. Those are some of the things that they offer right now.
Okay, great. And Eric, how about you? What are the pluses and minuses for you since joining Substack?
Yeah, I mean, I think my thinking, of leaving Bloomberg in the pandemic and doing a Substack was like partially business motivated and partially just sort of boring journalism motivated. On the one hand, felt like the newsletter thing was going to take off. Getting early on platforms has always been like a good way to build an audience. And then on the journalism side, I was excited about the opportunity to be more of a sort of reported opinion style, like a mix of column and reporting. And I feel like those are hard jobs sometimes to get in journalism, to move off sort of the beat and then stay sort of reporting. So I think both of those have borne out. And, I just like to be able to have my own voice. I like to be able to, really write for my customers and have a direct, I feel like even at Bloomberg, which is plenty financial, there was a degree to which we were translating venture capital to a broader audience. And now, like, if you don't know who Bill Gurley is, like, I don't need you, you know what I mean? You shouldn't really subscribe like that. That's sort of like the entry point, I think. And that just makes it a lot easier for people. It just means your readers feel in it. And it's really, part of the reason I created it in the pandemic was that, Silicon Valley was dispersing. There was no place, I live in Brooklyn. And so it's like, how do we create a place online where that story is playing out? So that's been fun. I like sort of writing for insiders. The downside, yeah, exactly what Casey said, just you can't, well, the last upside is also just like any incremental revenue, goes to you in a way that people like to judge my salary as it is, but presumably if I can grow faster than I churn, if I have a great story in the next couple of months, I'll see the direct benefit from that instead of just being resentful that somehow I'm doing disproportionate work and not getting sort of the same credit. On the downside, I mean, it's just like it's way more work. Even if I don't publish, first of all, anytime you promise novelty, that's hard. So if you're like, okay, I'm not matching, and at Bloomberg, obviously I'd break stuff, but I'd also just have weeks where I just matched other things that happened, which is like psychologically more straightforward. And then, yeah, I mean, weeks where I'm really sort of dreading writing a post, I mean, it looms over you. Long weekends can suck in the newsletter business because at the end of the day, I still need the same amount of time to deliver the work. And so having a random day off, but I have taken vacation days, but there it's like, I say very clearly, I'm taking, these weeks off. I'm taking, I took 2 weeks off. I'll take another 2 probably. But yeah, so it's just, it hangs on you. It's your business. And then, I think there's this belief that Substackers, roll their eyes at editors, but certainly doing this job now, there's a sense that like, oh, like having someone edit for you, someone serve as your therapist, someone help you with distribution, like those were all like perks of like the media business and not necessarily things that were being used. I mean, they controlled you, but they also sort of helped you. And so, I have to wear all those hats, which is fun and exhausting.
Yeah. Britt just put up a reminder. Anybody who has questions or comments, please use the Q&A function. Don't use the chat function. And we'll try to get to them early on. So really gonna go to Casey, because Casey, I believe I read you something you said, which is this is a hits business. I'd like you both to talk about that because, I'm a journalist myself, but I don't luckily have to break news very often. I'm more of an interpretive journalist, which is hits. Trying to break news is not easy. Can you talk about that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would have done this unless I were pretty well established on my beat. I decided maybe 5 or 6 years ago that I just wanted to make social networks the main thing I covered, like probably forever. I've like since broadened that lens out a little bit more to like platforms generally, because I like the flexibility to write about Apple and Amazon sometimes, or, more recently, some of these crypto platforms. But I was already getting a steady stream of tips. And I found that writing a newsletter was actually a great way to get more tips because the publication is so niche-y that it attracts people who care a lot. And when they find somebody else who cares a lot, they want to help that person. And so that was sort of the reason to do it. Now, of course, it's still a challenge. I don't know any reporter who feels like they have enough sources. Certainly, I don't feel that way. And so it's a challenge. Now, the flip side of that, and maybe the sort of more positive framing of the thing that I said about it being a hits business, is every time you break news, you get a raise. Like, this is a really cool dynamic in journalism. I'm actually sad that more journalists do not have this thing in your life where, like, imagine if imagine if like the Facebook Files reporters were all like, seeing bonuses every day based on the accretion to the recurring revenue that the Wall Street Journal is now experiencing, no doubt, because of their success. So that is the joy of it when it happens.
But to be specific here, the reason you get more revenue is that more people sign up, right? I mean, describe the process by which a big story, a big scoop leads to more subscribers.
Yeah, so there's sort of 2 ways. One, for example, so earlier this year, I wrote stories about this company Basecamp, which tried to ban politics in the workplace, essentially. And I was able to really tell sort of how that happened from start to finish. And I talked to the founders and I talked to the employees and was able to really tell that in a comprehensive way. And a lot of people just immediately bought annual subscriptions. And it wasn't so much that they wanted to read paywalled content, although that was part of it. It was like they wanted to thank me and encourage me to do more of that work, right? So sometimes you just sort of get this immediate kind of thank you sign up, which is like very gratifying. But there's a second way too, which is the way that my newsletter works is I send out 1 free edition every week and then 3 paid editions to subscribers. That free edition now actually reaches more than 50,000 people. And every time I send out a weekly edition, I try to offer them some enticement to sign up. So basically those free editions serve as kind of the top of the funnel. And over time, you sort of never know what is going to be the thing that makes one of those people say, now I'm actually going to subscribe because I want to go deeper, into this realm. So sometimes there's a little bit of a longer fuse where maybe you see a hit story and it's free and it doesn't make you want to give me money, but you think, I want to stay in touch with this person. I want to see what else they write about. And then, as the weeks go on, they get more and more likely to pay up.
Just that example you gave of Basecamp, had never even heard of the company until I read your post about it. And then I went and looked, and it's actually a really small company. So do you think that, and yet clearly people cared a lot about it. So it wasn't because of the amount of revenue it generates or anything like that. So what was it about Basecamp that you spotted? You said, this is going to be something that's going to work for my audience.
It's funny. On one hand, that company was very influential in Silicon Valley because its founders had really sort of styled themselves as thought leaders. They'd written books about how to do a company. And so there was a generation of people in this world who had grown up taking advice from those two specifically about how to do companies. And then when everything went down, all of those people felt betrayed and they wanted to know how it happened. So, there was, I think that was one reason why I was drawn to that story. The other reason I was drawn to that story was it was one of those where I just had good sources early on, and everyone I talked to wanted to recommend that I talk to 5 other people who then all agreed to talk. And it was just sort of one of the, sometimes you kind of run into a brick wall. And that was one where it's like every time I knocked on a door, it opened. And I thought, well, why don't I tell the story? And then, the final thing, and we see this all the time now. I mean, it's like Insider now basically just has this cottage industry and they just try to write a story about any company. It's like, well, what is literally any turmoil that has happened inside this company? But this one is like, there was a lot of really interesting turmoil. And I think people always want to read about businesses in crisis. And, that was one of those.
Yeah. So we have some questions from the audience, and I'm going to ask Eric to answer them, but Casey, feel free to jump in too. Some people just want more of a primer on what Substack is, the business model, and how the revenue sharing and that kind of thing. Also, whether they have advertising, you want to know, do they have competitors? So can you just, Eric, maybe you start, and then Casey can jump in.
I mean, Substack, they take 10% of your subscription revenue, and then basically Stripe, the payments processor, takes another 3%. You as the writer have like a direct relationship with Stripe and own the email relationship, and then Substack just makes it easy to plug in with Stripe, provides the publishing tools, and they have plenty of competitors. Ghost provides like a free one, Twitter, there's Review, there's a Facebook one, WordPress is, I think, in this, there are lots of options. I mean, Substack is super zeitgeisty. I think part of the reason, when I was deciding to start a newsletter, I was like playing around with WordPress, and it was like, oh, I'm going to have to design a page. And I was thinking about Ghost, and I reached out to them, and they were like, we can answer any questions over email. And Hamish, the co-founder of Substack, talked to me on the phone. And I do think Substack has taken a very hands-on approach. They offered me a $20,000 advance, which I didn't take because I didn't think it was a good financial deal. Other people with larger Twitter followings have gotten better offers and taken them. But they're just shown that they're hands-on. Like Casey, they've subsidized my health insurance. Now that I have a podcast, they're excited about that. So they're helping with an audio editor. So it is very much like it feels like they try to earn the 10% with advice and sort of random support, and it just sort of works. And I think there's also the belief, if you're on Substack, that they're sort of a well-intentioned company that's trying to grow and will have more tools. The company just said, oh, we're thinking about distribution and a couple, so it's like I'm growing, they're growing. If ever I'm sort of Ben Thompson level, maybe 10% will feel like a real burden. But at the end of the day, like ease of use, feeling like you can call somebody or several people at this point is like a big value. Somebody asked about advertising. Yeah, some of the Substack, the company, doesn't really believe in advertising and doesn't provide tools for it. But there are people who, if you run on Substack and don't charge subscription fees, you're not paying Substack anything. So you can just use it as a publishing tool. And then there are people like Packy McCormick with large audiences that are basically, you know, ad generated with sort of native advertising. Yeah, so that, and then whether a Substack itself is a great business, I think it is hard. You know, it's hard. It's a small margin. It's very competitive. Its customers are very sensitive, but of course, it doesn't really need to be a great business for it to be, you know, a good platform for us to use to publish.
Question to either one of you can jump in on that came in. What made you confident that you could make the shift to running your own newsletter? What did you do any kind of formal research or talk to people? Or, because it is a big leap.
Yeah, I'm sort of a weird case because I had written a newsletter for The Verge for 3 years. It had about 24,000 subscribers. I didn't actually think I would be able to take the mailing list with me, but I wound up cutting a deal with The Verge where I was able to take that. But a lot of it just came down to like, I believed that enough people cared about what I was doing that I would be able to eke out a living. You know, there was actually a huge advantage in starting during the pandemic, which was that I was living like a retiree. I only spent money on groceries. My personal expenses had never been lower. And it felt like it was worth a shot. I did, my Twitter following had gotten pretty big. And I just kept like thinking of it in terms of percentages. You know, I was like, if 1% of my Twitter followers pay me, like, it's a great job, you know? And if I can get that to 3%, it's a better job than anyone will give me. And it just sort of like felt like it was worth a shot.
Yeah. Hey, speaking, I'm glad you brought up Twitter, Casey, because another thing I think you said is that a lot of your traffic gets driven through Twitter. You talk about that, and also I want to hear what Eric says about that afterward.
Yeah, I mean, you know, as I'm sure all of us here know, like Twitter is where the media hangs out all day. It's where the news happens, and it's where all of us are competing every day in this kind of brutal marketplace for attention. You know, the upside of it, though, is when you write a good post and people see it and they start sharing it, it generates discussion. And then some of those people come in and they sign up for your free newsletter, and some of them pay. So I think it's sort of the best daily opportunity to get in front of people who have never heard of you. And I think that's the reason that it winds up becoming this source of growth, right? You build up an audience, that audience wants to share the stuff that you're doing that they think is cool, and that brings in more people over time. It's going to be hard for Substack to come up with, I think, a similarly powerful dynamic.
So specifically, how does stuff migrate from your posts, which go to subscribers, onto Twitter?
Yeah, so I mean, every day I tweet my newsletter, and I usually just say, I wrote about this, and I'll put a screenshot that I think has either the most interesting fact or the best writing or whatever it is. People click on it, they go to a landing page, and then Substack puts up a pop-up that says, hey, do you want to subscribe to this? And a lot of times, you know, people will say yes. So that's how the flow works.
Hey, Eric, how about you? Do you find that Twitter is an important way?
Oh, it's definitely it's definitely the biggest driver. I mean, I only had 19,000 followers. I probably have like 24, 25 now. So I spend a lot of time begging Casey to retweet my stories. No, somewhat true. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think Twitter's important. I mean, when Substack, really, the company, you know, argues that you should just give away a lot of stuff for free. I mean, I think that's true. And I sort of don't do it enough. I mean, part of what's interesting about the Substack model, right, is that you have free posts and paid posts. It's not like a metered paywall like the media. And now you can even put your paywall, it's sort of down the page wherever you want it. So it does feel like, you know, you get subscribers when they read something you like for free, or they see it on Twitter. And so just giving them the content is important. Now, at the same time, you know, we want people to feel like they're getting what they pay for. I promise, you know, a paid post a week. So I'm on the lockdown, you know, and I only publish once or twice a week. So a big percentage of my posts are paid and pretty locked down. So Twitter is just like a great place to provide free stuff. Like Casey said, you know, put the best paragraph or two and let people retweet and comment on it. And then that will reach the audience of people who really care about that. I mean, I will say that on the flip side for my newsletter, there is a level of just like, it's you know, it's you know, trade publications have existed, you know, it's a small enough universe that I can forward it to a bunch of VCs and I'll get meaningful subscribers that way because they want to stay on top of it. So I think on the sort of big funnel, get a big free list, Twitter, LinkedIn are extremely important, but then there is sort of a direct paid strategy that I don't take enough time to do, but it has built up the subscriber base.
A lot of different ways we can go here, but one thing I was fascinated about, because I've started subscribing to both of your newsletters, just partly because I knew I was doing this, but I'm interested too. Casey, you just wrote this week about the disagreement over crypto. In the community is divided between and what I realized in reading that is that this online tech world moves so fast that it is so hard to keep on top of. You got a lot of smart people who are spending hours a day in ferment, going back and forth with each other, and there's a racing ahead of the general public. It's like trying to catch a tiger by the tail. Sometimes it must be like, even for you, it's like, Casey's an hour late on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, this dynamic that you're describing is why I started a newsletter. Like originally it was not designed to be the primary showcase for my reporting or analysis. I really just wanted to round up links related to what sort of later came to be called the tech lash. Like I started it in the fall of 2017, where people were starting to get pretty mad at Facebook about the Russia investigation. And there were more links that I could keep track of. And I was just sort of reading all this stuff and doing nothing with it. And I went to my bosses and I'd say, can I maybe just do a newsletter of this stuff? I think it might be valuable. And they said, well, how long is that going to take every day? I said, I don't know, an hour. And then that turned out to be a lie. It was more like 4, but by then it was too late. I'd already started doing it. But I continue to think that is one reason why my newsletter has succeeded, is because it is not a cult of my personality. It's also trying to supply some utility to the world and say, hey, you can get off Twitter all day. Like I will email you at 5 p.m. Pacific time, and I will tell you the stories that mattered in our world. And I continue to believe that is like a core pillar of what the thing that I'm doing is.
So you're the ultimate person with his finger on the pulse. You just got to really. I mean, it must be hard because once you get a reputation for that, people expect that from you. You can't afford not to be up to speed, right?
Yes and no. I think my audience has proven to be pretty forgiving. I don't for example, I used to write it 5 days a week. Then I told the audience, I was like, I'm going to move to 4 days a week so that I can do more original reporting. Everyone was okay with that, even though it arguably removed some of that kind of pure utility from the newsletter. I also heavily rely on the reporting of others, right? I rely on other aggregators. There's a great aggregator in Silicon Valley called TechMeme, which just does a first pass on the day's news. And then I can sort of make use of that to kind of quickly navigate. So I'm getting a lot of help.
That's good. And Eric, you write less frequently. I mean, what was your thinking on that? You're not trying to be clone of what Casey's doing, right?
Yeah. Why?
Eric? Yeah, I know. I'm such. There are pros and obviously. I mean, Casey. I always know not to text him right before his newsletter is about to go out. He's definitely spending more time in front of the keyboard. I mean, I just it's a sort of audience that really values their time, and I think picking my spots when I have something interesting to say. I mean, it has to do with what Casey was saying about sort of the big hits. If I do a big, I did this big deep dive into Bessemer Venture Partners, or, I do a lot of these story of the cap table where it's how did the early investors build up their positions? And people value that more than when I write, a column. And there is a degree to which, if I were to write more often than I would need, I mean, in some ways, I think about if I had a more straightforward approach to the news and riffed on stuff more, then I would feel less pressure to do something novel. But I don't know. Yeah, it's a struggle and it's very iterative. But Casey, sorry.
Well, I would say that to speak up on Eric's behalf, I also think that you want people to be excited when your byline shows up in their inbox, right?
Right.
Like I want people to be excited every time I show up, but I email people 4 times a week. So I know that in practice, it's kind of like when The Economist starts stacking up in your house and you're like, why did I subscribe to this thing? Right. And whereas if you're Eric and it's like, I'm going to email you less frequently, but it's going to be jam-packed with original reporting, your customers are probably going to be more excited about it over time. And it's going to feel like a really kind of high signal publication, which just to keep rambling, is like one of the other things that sets this sort of newsletter journalism apart, right? Like I used to work for a website that wrote 50 stories a day, right? None of us who even worked there were reading all of the content that we produce. So I think there's actually a lot of value in dramatically reducing the amount of coverage that a publication is doing.
Yeah. Well, I
Thank
write
you.
3 times a week for the Times. And when I was hired, they didn't tell me to write 3 times a week. I think that the assumption would be 2, but I said I actually wanted to write 3, trying to strike that balance, because I thought that my pieces, I wanted to be able to be close to the news, and it's harder to do that if you're not coming out as often. And yet, as you said, the economists stacking up, I can look right over next to my desk here and I see a bunch of economists stacking up. So I can totally relate to that. And I actually have had a couple of readers say to me, why are you writing so much? I can't keep up with what you're writing. And it's like, oh man, that kind of hurts. Cause like, I don't want people to start thinking, I'm not getting to this. Why should I even be subscribing? The other issue is that Steve Shepard, the former editor-in-chief of Business Week, used to say, you're in a very competitive environment. People are looking for an excuse not to read you because they're so busy. The competition is more for time than it is with the competition. It's like the first day you write something that they've read elsewhere, that gives them permission to say, that's Me Too journalism. I don't need it anymore. So it's almost, he used to say, it's better not to write anything at all than it is to write something that is just repeating something someone else has already said.
I do think that you are incentivized to keep it really fresh here. But, I've also found I think if you've carved out a good enough niche, like if you really have worked your beat and you're really an authority on your beat, people will wait 2 or 3 days for your take, right? As long as you have the goods when it shows up. So yeah, I agree. It's always best to break news. I do believe in scoops above all else, even though I publish relatively few of them. But you can, I think there can also be value in sitting on an idea for a day or two. Again, it's in a very quick twitch, media world that is built for sharing on Twitter, right. Taking a day and saying, I'm going to think about this, can also set you apart.
No, but that's actually consistent with what I'm saying, because if all you do is you feel like I have to say something right now and it's nothing new, well, you shouldn't have bothered.
Yeah. I mean, half of my Twitter timeline is just journalists who feel like they have to say something right now. And it's, and everyone is wasting their time, I think.
Right, exactly, yeah. I just want to interject something from a member of the audience, John Jacobs wrote, this is more of an observation, but this reminds me a little of what the great Francine McKenna did 15 or so years ago. Sensing that she was a better reporter, more knowledgeable in her field than anyone in the media, she adopted as her vehicle her own blog that regularly scooped Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, and the specialized accounting press. Then several years later, she went to Market Watch. Do you have any thoughts about that find? Otherwise, that's an interesting observation.
Yeah, it's definitely the case. There were paper newsletters before there were Substack. So I never want to pretend that I'm blazing a trail over here.
Right, Esther Dice. There's a long history of sort of specialized newsletters and stuff, and we get excited about it every so often and make it seem novel, but it's not. I do think part of what's novel now is obviously the distribution tools are much easier. People have built the followings on Twitter on the back of their employers. Substack makes it extremely easy. It's just the barriers to entry are much lower. So it's the classic technology story. Yeah, people did it before, but it was probably a little bit more work, and now it's easier. So you're seeing more people who are willing to, the fact that, to criticize myself, finding the design of my website would have been something that prevented me from doing this is quite possible. But then Substack figured out, oh, you don't even need to design a website. It is literally just like a step above Twitter. And I was willing to do it. They're just, when it's not your specialty, it's just a hurdle. And so stripping away all those hurdles so that you can just start a business on the back of, your actual expertise, which is writing, just lowers the entry point for a lot of people.
One thing I corresponded with Kara Swisher because she works for the Times, and of course has her own gigs as well. And she knows both of you guys really well, and she said nice things about you. And the two of you know each other well, and then there's Charlie. And what surprises me kind of, and I told Kara this, is that since you're all out there trying to break news, it's almost a little surprising to me that there's so much camaraderie and support amongst you. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the world that we cover is so vast and honestly relatively undercovered that there is this persistent sense that there is enough to go around for everyone. Like when you look at how big a company like a Facebook or an Amazon is, and like you look at the number of beat reporters who are assigned to it full time, like it's smaller than the White House press corps in every single case. And yet these are effectively like quasi nation states unto their own. So like if I write about Facebook and like Alex Heath, like who's at The Verge, like breaks a big story about Facebook, I don't usually have this sense of like, oh no, I've been crushed, like unless I was working on the exact same story. And that has happened to me plenty. But by and large, I just really think there are enough stories to go around. And also sometimes like if somebody's working on the same story as you, like it wasn't that good of a story, it's like, maybe it was a little too easy to get.
Casey also has a very generous spirit. It's funny. I called him up when I was thinking about doing a newsletter. I honestly didn't know he was about to do it. I was like, hey, Casey, I'm thinking about doing a newsletter. He's like, I'm about to quit my job, do a newsletter. So yeah, I mean, it is close. We're across the coast, but we've known each other. And now we have Side Channel, which Casey came up with a great idea for, and we have sort of a group of newsletter writers, and we all have very different sensibilities. I mean, Casey and I are both on the tech leaderboard, but I mean, we don't compare email lists, but I suspect a lot of our customers are actually different people, and we write about fairly different things. So, I mean, it's, there's certainly overlap of interest if you're just like a hardcore sort of tech follower. I'm sure like there are lots of PR monitors who subscribe to both of ours, but I think the core base are very different, and that's sort of the fun of having a Discord community that we're still figuring out, but where we can sort of cross-pollinate sort of adjacent beats, which is
I'm actually glad you brought that up, because I intended to ask a question about that. Casey, I'll ask you this one. Tell us about Side Channel. First, just explain what it is and then how it's working so far.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, if you're not familiar with Discord, I encourage you to get it and check it out. Like one of my hot takes is I think every American newsroom will have an active Discord server within the next 5 years. It's basically a place where your community can interact with you or your representatives directly. They can talk about what's going on. They can meet the journalists. I basically had an idea of like, could you create an equivalent to like the newsroom Slack that I was in for the past 7 years, stock it with, other independent journalists who I like, but then let in the readers come in and talk about the days of news with us, right? So like that was the idea. We've been building it. There's some things that have gone well, some things that haven't gone well. But by and large, it's been, I think, invaluable to like have that kind of direct communication with people who like aren't just my readers, but are my customers. So like one of the things that I love about it is like I get to have personal interaction with a huge number of people who subscribe to me, like beyond that interaction in their email. So that's basically what it is. And it's been going since like May. So I think and Eric and I have recently been talking about, what are the next steps and how do we keep building it out?
Now, it's anonymous, right?
It's pseudonymous. What I tell people is I cannot guarantee that your name will never be leaked, but like I personally am not going to be trying to figure out who you really are. We just ask that people don't like misrepresent themselves. I did have somebody in my channels with the username Zuck, and I looked at his email address and I was like, I don't think you're Mark Zuckerberg. Could you please change your name? But yeah,
you can have it doesn't have to be your real name that appears, but I don't know what the
right. Yeah, you can use
sort
a
of
pseudonym.
that is.
But sometimes that can create bad behaviors if people are hiding behind a false identity, right?
Yes, and our biggest anxiety was, what if we open this up and the whole room just like fills up with trolls? And
especially with Casey, he runs a newsletter on good management of tech platforms, so it would have been a great test case for somebody to really like give him a hard time.
I sort of told myself that like even if I had a massive like content moderation disaster, like while I was sure it would be painful, like it would also make for a great story for me to write. Fortunately, like that didn't happen. But I do think there's value in trying to like run a community as a journalist. Like I will also say, by the way, I've been absolutely exasperated by my own community lately, because basically to a person, they hate the idea of cryptocurrencies and the idea that any company would be built around them. And I am curious about them. And my curiosity is journalistic. Like I want to know what these platforms are doing and who's building them and how they work and what are the pros and what are the cons. And my community is just like dragging
too many scolds in your audience.
Yeah,
you need more. It's time to build a crowd.
Yes, I audience. Know. I want more Republicans in my server, so I need to find them.
Well, so actually, that's also totally fascinating, because you think when you're working for a publication that depends on advertising that you're beholden to the advertisers, but when you're now you're beholden to subscribers in some sense, right? That's a challenge all of its own.
Yeah, and I sort of wrote about this in my my sort of year one post, but it's like my number one fear is that I wind up feeling captured by the audience. But the reason I think it's ultimately going okay is because like I'm captured by multiple audiences, right? So it's like a lot of my paying subscribers work for big tech platforms, right? So the fear there is always that I'm going to go too soft on big tech platforms. But then I also just have people who are in the kind of like tech, like civic society space, like academia, nonprofits, and like they're the ones telling me that I'm always going too soft on the companies, right? So it's like I'm just trying to like position myself at the uncomfortable middle of like all of these interest groups and trust that like in aggregate they will keep me honest.
Yeah. How about you, Eric? How have you dealt with that?
I mean, for the most part, I sort of write about competing institutions, right? I mean, it's like different venture firms and startups competing with each other. So when it's just sort of in the lens of like the business dynamics between different players, there's sort of the inherent competitive pressure there, and your customers want sort of, half the people want Andreessen Horowitz to be sort of eviscerated and other people are cheering for them. But it's been the hardest, just when to weigh into politics, right? I mean, part of it is just now, if I were at Bloomberg, I had a beat that was like venture capital. There would be no real reason for me to weigh into politics. But when it feels like, some political story, whether it was like the Capitol riots and everything, and just it can just feel like as a reporter that it's hard to ignore it, and then I'll want to weigh in, and it'll feel sort of I guess what I'm saying is part of it is I have the freedom to write what I want. And if I decide it's important, I can write it, even if you were saying it's probably not sort of the topic of your newsletter. I still make it about tech. So in some ways, I feel like I have more freedom to offend my audience, because I don't have an editor saying like, that's not on your beat. Like, why would you sound off on it?
Yeah. But
the
political thing, after Trump left office, a lot of the news media lost audience. CNN's audience crashed, and same with a bunch of the others. Is there anything analogous in your world where certain topics just generate traffic, and if that topic goes away, then everybody loses interest?
Yes. I mean, I felt it when Trump left office. And it wasn't so much that like I had massive churn, but I think there was this transitional period where the newsletter had to figure out what it was about again, because for the past, ever since I started writing it, there was just this conveyor belt of catastrophes coming out of the Trump administration that were like implicating platforms in some way. And so almost any day of the week, I could sort of chunk off a piece of that and dig in. And then all of a sudden, Joe Biden is president, and Congress is doing some things and he's making some noises, but there isn't this sense of everything might be about to change forever. And so what does the newsletter become? And so, it has pushed me to try out some other topics on people, including cryptocurrency, because it's like, this is what the people that I know and I think are interesting are working in, but now we have to test the audience's appetite for that. And, there is going to be a little bit of thrash. Just to keep harping on this point, for the first time yesterday, I had a paid subscriber, a man who gave me $100 in May, write to me to tell me that he hopes that I die because I had not sufficiently blasted the cryptocurrency crowd. And I was like, this is really amazing. But of course, it made me want to write about it more, because I'm like, anything that is generating this level of insanity in my inbox, like is clearly a story. So, but yes, there's been a kind of break, I think, from whatever newsletters and media generally was before Trump.
Yeah. Just a reminder, folks, still entertaining questions from the audience, questions and comments. We still have a few minutes left here. There's one here from Leonard Sloan, longtime member of the Financial Writers Association. Who sets the price of your newsletter, you or Substack, and how do you determine a price?
Eric, do you want to take that?
Well, it's very arbitrary. We set it. I charge $150 a year, $15 a month. I think Casey charges $10 a month, $100 a year. Before I put up my paywall, basically I launched in October with no paywall and said, you can pay me and I'll give you a 40% discount. So it was $9 a month and $90 a year. And then when I put up the paywall, I got rid of the discount. And so it was pretty arbitrary. I mean, you're just sort of looking at what other people pay. I think if I were like to do a real assessment, I would make more money at like 20 or 25, but there's a degree to which like I'm willing to take the hit for reach. And it's just like, I have like 1,300 paying subscribers. If I had 1,000, but was charging significantly more, like I'd have more money, but it's nice to have an audience. So I think there are factors outside of pure price perfection. And then I also have a founding subscription where I just say like, you get your heart warmed or something by feeling like you're supporting, an upstart newsletter that costs $250 a year. And, every once in a while somebody buys one of those and it warms my heart. And I try to send them an email and thank them. So that's sort of my pricing. Casey, were you more scientific?
It was not scientific. When I was like, coming up with how I was going to do platformer, I was largely just copying Ben Thompson at Stratechery. Ben launched at $10 a month. I think he'd like just gone up to 12. And I thought like, well, whatever I'm doing is not going to be as good as what Ben is doing. So like, I'm going to just undercharge relative to Ben.
Gotta charge what the market will bear,
But I mean, a thing Ben has said to me is that a mistake a lot of people make is charging too little, right? Like Eric and I are both writing things that are kind of trade publications. Both of us assume that our work is being expensed. And that gives us a little bit more flexibility. We're also writing for rich people. That gives you flexibility. It's like $100 is a lot of money for a subscription to like most people for most media products, but it's like the people we're writing for, they don't even think about it, right? They spent that much on dinner tonight. So that's kind of how
you think that. I just had someone unsubscribe. They literally wrote me, we get the notes. Eric is fucking awesome. I'm just broke, smiley face. So,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like Ben also has a really a sort of firm policy about like he doesn't do student discounts. Like there's sort of like a lot of things that I could do if I wanted to broaden the reach, but I honestly like the challenge of writing something that is worth paying for, right? Like I am trying to create a high quality thing that makes people feel like they got their money's worth. Also, I think that charging a lot for something can make something feel really good and prestigious, right? This is the messed up thing about capitalism, right? Where it's like, sometimes I see a newsletter, I'm like, $5 a month. Well, how good can that be? So it's, I mean, every time I talk to somebody who runs like a subscription product, they all say like, pricing is the absolute most mysterious thing to them. Their assumptions are always sort of go out the window once they actually put it in the market. But I've been like pretty happy with like where I'm at. So
maybe you should both raise your subscription prices.
yeah.
I'm honestly not sure. This speaks to I'm not sure if I raise my prices, it would affect all my existing customers or how much. Anyway, that's yeah, it could be a complicated thing.
So,
Oh, you're muted. Yeah.
I was muted, yes, but I'm back on now. We got a few more things that just came in here. How about podcasting? Is that an option on Substack as well, as opposed to written material? Since we're running out of time, I'm going to ask all three questions at once because I want to make sure we get them all in. So that's one, podcasting. Next one is, this is to both from Greg. That was from Sam Friedman. Next one is from Greg Miles. This is to both Casey and Eric. How do you see the Substack medium evolving over the next 5 years, risks and opportunities? Do you think you'll still be writing your newsletters then? And then the last question, and this is probably all we're going to have time for, is how much churn do you have? So
let's do the last first because it's the least happy. I mean, I would say it's like single-digit percent. I mean, it's hard to say because churn is very like specific to, the period of time. I don't know, Casey, if you have a good number for it off the top of your head.
My churn is like 3 to 4% a month. It spiked a little bit during my annual renewal period. And then the other thing that I remember is that at the end of last year, like churn went way up and I lost like 20 or 30 paid subscribers. And it was like the first time I'd ever seen like
brutal
a drop.
Yeah.
And what people told me was that apparently at the end of the year, a lot of people review their finances, which, I'm a reporter. I don't review my finances, but apparently this is a thing that people do. So, it's a thing, but growth has been higher than churn. So
right, that's the key. Yeah, it's like reporters. I mean, understandably like to talk about churn, but it's like, are you growing more than you're churning? I think I did have 1 month where I might have churned to net, which was depressing, but overall more growth than churn.
Yeah, and Eric, you should talk about podcasting.
Oh, podcasting. Yeah, so I just literally today transferred my podcast to Substack. It was on Anchor, so it like flows, through either Anchor or Substack. You can consume it now in the email, you click a play button, but it still, flows to Apple and Spotify. Substack's trying to make a push. Their analytics are sort of weak. I mean, they're not really focused on advertising. So then you sort of want a podcast that is meant to bolster, your subscription product, but you could read in your own ads if you wanted. They clearly want to invest there. So again, it's sort of like they're paying for my audio editor. So that's the very clear-eyed, like why I decided to move it there. And it's also just more content for my newsletter that's related to my newsletter. But yeah, so they're very early on audio, but they've said they want to do more audio and video. Casey, you want to take a stab at their plans?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, Substack is the most expensive of these platforms, full stop. Like no other platform charges more than 5% of revenue. Some platforms like Ghost charge a monthly fee. I think everybody's going to feel differently about this. I do think that there is a group of people who like, look, if let's say you've just like barely cracked 6 figures, you're paying Substack 8 or 10K a year. Maybe that feels like a reasonable compromise for what you're getting. But imagine a world where you have 5,000 paid subscribers, you're making $500,000 a year, you're paying $50,000 to Substack. Like, why wouldn't you just take that same $50,000 and hire a junior web developer and get yourself a proper website, right? So I think that I have been saying this to Substack from the beginning. They're aware it's an issue. Their challenge to themselves is like, can they dramatically accelerate the growth of my publication using various tools? Maybe they can make that work. We'll see. I will say, when I started Platformer, it was with the assumption that Substack was not its final home and that it would eventually move to the open web. But I sure hope I'll still be writing my newsletter. Like, I love this line of work. This is absolutely the most fun that I've ever had in journalism. I feel like I spent so many years not knowing what I was doing and just being sat at my desk every day because I felt like everyone else had figured it out but me. Like the newsletter medium really suits me. So Yeah.
Nice. And you, Eric?
Just like concluding thought or
Well, yeah, but concluding thought, but the question is like, how do you see Substack evolving and how do you see yourself evolving over the next 5 years or so?
Yeah, well, I mean, Substack's hard to say. I really do think they need to get in the discovery business. Like the fact that we're still relying on Twitter is really the big shortcoming of their vision, because they really sell you, it's an anti-Twitter message in some ways, and then they don't sort of decouple you from Twitter. So, I could see them taking some percentage, a bigger percent if they can drive users and cross promotion. And so I do think, that's sort of the future for them. For me, there's sort of two worlds you can see. Like on the one hand, the beauty of a newsletter is that your cost. And so that as your revenue grows, you become more and more profitable, and the benefit accrues to you. But then on the other hand, every young sort of media entrepreneur has been tempted by hubris and says, oh, I should build a company. And the part of the problem with the newsletter is that you have to produce the content yourself instead of, lording over other people who produce some of the content too. And so I think year 2 for me, which I've just entered, is another, become more profitable, keep hard at it, figure out with the voice, like build your reputation. And then I think, maybe in year 4 or 5, there will be that question. And, obviously we're reporters. I feel like there's a level of like, if you were too profitable, it would feel like you almost sort of need to hire people. I'm not promising that, but there is sort of like, oh, if it was a really profitable business, then maybe, you need to sort of throw the money to new interesting journalists.
And I mean, I would say like, I very much want to do that. If I can create a sustainable media job, like what more fun could you possibly have in journalism than just like putting up a middle finger to the entire advertising business and every private equity firm and every like Gannett, and just be like, no, these two people, like they can have these jobs as long as they want them. Like there really is an opportunity to build a version of this business that is better for the people who actually work in it. And I can't imagine anything more exciting to work on.
You're muted.
It's noisy here. That's why I put you on mute. One last thing, and then we're going to close it up. Somebody says there's no reporting teams on Substack. It's all individuals. Is that pretty much still the case? I mean, side channel being sort of a hybrid exception.
There's you are starting to see some reporting teams. Like there's the Bulwark, which is this sort of like sensible conservatism publication. They have a team. There's the Dispatch, which is sort of another conservative publication. They've hired a bunch of people.
And Barry Weiss, runs a lot of other people's work. And Matt Iglesias has a researcher and runs other bylines.
There's also a much smaller one, which I personally find more exciting, called the Arizona Agenda. It's 2 reporters who are just trying to make local journalism work on Substack. These are just, 2 relatively young reporters. They've started a publication. I think they said they're about a third of their way toward their payments goal. So if you live in Arizona and want to support local journalism, check out Arizona Agenda. It's not expensive. So you are seeing people start to experiment with this. I mean, one thing I would say again is like the economics of this are really good. You do not need that many, think about, I think of like the salaries I've been paid my entire career. You do not need to find that many people on the internet to pay you $5 or $10 a month to make as much as you are making or more. And so the idea that you'd be able to hire a second reporter should not be that daunting, right? You're talking about adding a couple of thousand subscribers. So there's really a lot of untapped potential there, I think, particularly in local journalism.
Great. Well, guys, it's coming up on 8:30, and we've answered a lot of questions from the audience and questions from me, and you've had a good interchange with each other, and it's been a very successful session. So really, really appreciate you both.
Thank you so much. It's been so much fun. Yeah.
Good. Well, and wish you all the best with your Substacks.
Thank you. And I would remind you that all of you listening can absolutely expense both of our Substacks. So we encourage you to do that as first.
No
thing.
question.
Yeah.
No question.
Platformer, what is it? It's .news, right?
It's platformer.news
and newcomer.co. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Platformer.news and newcomer.co. Go for it, guys. Yeah.